Okay, welcome everybody to the International Peace Course where we've been working in cycles, and today we're finishing the cycle The Right to Rebel. This is our fifth topic, and today we're going to work on international experiences of rebellion. We're going to close this cycle with this topic, but at the same time, we're going to open the next one. We're very thankful to Kristina Conti for accepting our invitation. She's in Manila right now. She's a human rights lawyer, criminal lawyer, and works with political prisoners. She works closely with law and prison reform, peace, conflict resolution, and international humanitarian law. She has experience with strategic litigation and has worked with war on drugs policy. She is the Secretary General of the National Union of People's Lawyers and has been an insurgencies advisor in the framework of the peace process. Thank you for accepting our invitation and welcome.
Thank you as well. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, we're going to start with a context for those who don't really know what's happening in your country and what are the dynamics of social and political conflict that are happening right now in your country.
Mhm. So, the Philippine National Liberation Movement is against the backdrop of a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society with a history of direct colonization by Spain, occupation by the Japanese during the Second World War, and control by the United States of America since the turn of the 20th century. And in our history, as with yours and with others, oppression and exploitation has always engendered resistance. We start with Spanish colonialism. The Spaniards colonized the Philippines by force of arms. In the 16th century, and native inhabitants, of course, rose up. And the explorer Ferdinand Magellan was killed by Filipino chieftain Lapu-Lapu. All throughout the 333 years of colonization, there was resistance and rebellion. There was Lakandula, Sulaiman, peasant uprisings of Francisco Dagohoy and Gabriela Silang. At this point, let me pause so that we can make way for translation.
Thank you. So, in this context, how are the rebellion processes today regarding legal status and legal terms and persecution in your country?
Okay, so from that kind of history of uprising and rebellion, there was a qualitative leap. Sorry, but this will take us back to 1896. That was the first time that the Philippine society, that Filipinos came together in a revolution that demanded national independence from Spain and then social emancipation of peasants. So this kind of realization came about this era. And so forth after the World War II and direct control by the Americans. Under the Treaty of Paris, the Philippines was ceded to the Americans for about 20 million US dollars. So we were sold to the Americans, but the Americans didn't want us actually. Instead of annexing us like Cuba or taking us in like Puerto Rico, they decided that they were going to make an example of us and try to give us independence. But then, of course, you would still have the the problems of old. And in these problems of old, the Philippines remained feudal, reliant on agriculture, and because of the American influence, colonial. And it is in this context that the Philippine society, as was before, remains dominated by comprador bourgeoisie, huh? A landlord class that is subservient to, well, a new colonial order. And from this situation, we found ourselves in modern times still stuck under the same socioeconomic conditions that is reminiscent of those previous eras when there needed to be rebellion. As such, in modern times, we have seen several quote unquote revolutions in several presidencies. We had this is, I think, would be familiar, the peaceful revolution of EDSA. These peaceful revolutions allowed us to change presidents. When we had the dictator Ferdinand Marcos, we ousted him to put in Cory Aquino. But she remained the same, of the same stock as the big bourgeoisie comprador. And therefore, we had another revolution, most recently in 2000, to replace President Joseph Estrada with another president, Gloria Arroyo. And so it remains until today. In several parts of the Philippines, there are other rebellions, secessionist movements that have flourished. In particular, there is the Moro, um, a portion of Philippine society that has asked for secession or at the very least autonomy from the Philippines. Currently, we have a communist national liberation movement and several groups that have asked for secession, mainly based on religion, Muslim secessionist groups that have asked for autonomy from the current government. And it is difficult, really, because the very concept of the Philippines, we are an archipelago, is very hard to imagine. In fact, if you split up the Philippines into big island groups, you can just have three, and you can call them individually republics of their own. So, with these 7,000, I think 200 islands as of last count, 7,200 islands, the only thing that keeps us together is, well, we can say it's the name. The name Philippines is derived from the name of King Philip of Spain. And so it is very ironic to some extent that Philippine communist revolutionaries are moving forward, even despite this colonial history, moving forward to a future that we can claim our own, to be our own. Throughout the 50 years of guerrilla warfare of the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New People's Army, and under the more broader flank of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, despite changes in tactics of government in terms of methods, equipment, the basic rationale remains that we must be able to prove to ourselves what we are as a people.
Thank you, Kristina. Qassam Muaddi has just entered the room, to whom we're very thankful for accepting coming to talk to us. He's a journalist and a writer from Palestine, from Ramal. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Hey, Qassam. Welcome. So, welcome, Qassam. So to start this conversation, I would like to ask for the context of your country right now and for the context of the revolution and rebellion processes that are taking place at the moment, because we know mass media distorts the information we get. So, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be here with you all. I'm a journalist and a political scientist. I write about the current situation in social and political terms of Palestine for various media outlets. I'm going to start by speaking about the current situation in Palestine. Palestine is a physical embodiment of the exercise of the right to rebellion. Currently, we're living through a phenomenon that has been repeated many times in the modern history of Palestine. Palestinians without a political structure that represents them have consciousness about the political moment that they're going through and the necessity of exercising the right to rebellion. In a moment when the political class of Palestine is still trying to understand what's going on and how they can survive that moment. We've seen how there has been a spiral of violence in the West Bank, especially in Jenin. The Israeli army has been going into the cities of Palestine like they do every day, these supposedly autonomous cities of Palestine. In Jenin, the Palestinians have received the Israeli army not with rocks but with guns. Common people, regular people, they're not professional combatants, they're not part of a political structure. These are people that are just defending their neighborhood. And this is an example of a confrontation with the established authority in the country by people who understand that it's a political moment where it's necessary to go to the actions, to exercise rebellion. This current moment that Palestine is going through has shown various expressions from the Israeli government that show that this government has the intention of ending the conflict. A definitive historical end to the conflict. When you hear a definitive end to the conflict, it might sound good, but it really isn't. The Palestine conflict is a colonial conflict, a policy of replacing the population. It's exactly the same type of colonialism that destroyed indigenous civilizations in the American continent and the rest of the New World. This conflict can end in two ways: decolonization or the extermination of the autochthonous indigenous population, whereas completely or politically. So when Israel gives the administrative powers to a minister that is from the extreme right, the far right, that believes that everything is Israel and there's no space for Palestinians, that has an agenda of building more colonies, that says explicitly that he won't provide a single meter for Palestinians. When Israeli army goes into the cities much more, where every day they're killing people, where they're increasing the detentions of Palestinian leaders, even if they're cultural or social leaders, without any charges, legal charges. When this government speaks about the annexation of territories, it's because the government is going towards the goal of ending the conflict in the way that is convenient for them, which is not decolonization but extermination. So, if I speak about the right to rebellion in the Palestinian context from the beginning, for the Palestinian people, always existence, not just political existence, but every type of political expression has been connected to the exercise of the right to rebellion. From the beginning of the modern time or the current times, with the First World War, where Palestine leaves the Ottoman Empire and comes under British mandate. From that moment, what was going to happen with Palestine had been decided. And it meant not leaving any space for Palestinians to exist as a people. So Palestinians gained consciousness in the first moment in the elite, in the educated people. It wasn't initially an act of rebellion, it was actually a diplomatic action. And in 1919, when the British people hadn't established themselves completely, we have the first National Congress of Arabic People of Palestine. And this continued in the following years in Jerusalem. They sent a delegation to London to explain to the king the national aspirations of Palestine, and the Balfour Declaration is created, which recognizes space for Jewish European peoples. So it wasn't an act of rebellion, but our future had already been sealed. They already knew what was going to happen with Palestine. Arthur Balfour, who was the exterior relations or international relations minister of Britain, wrote in one of his letters that Zionism, this project of colonizing Palestine to create a Jewish state for Jewish people from Europe, it was based on traditions from the past, interests for the present, and hopes for the future, which were much more important than all of the aspirations of the I don't know how many thousand Arabs that currently lived in Palestine, which means my grandparents. So from that time in London, it was decided that Palestinians would be put to one side. So Palestinians gradually realized that to exist they had to rebel. But before the Palestinians understood this, the Zionists understood it. Siev Zapotetsky, who was Ukrainian or Russian, the Zionist ideologue of the Israeli state, wrote an article in 1929 which was titled "The Iron Wall." He stated that the Palestinian people were alive, not in a positive sense, but saying that they weren't going to allow us to colonize the territory. So they had to be forced through brute force to understand that they wouldn't be able to have their aspirations. So there had to be a consistent policy that figuratively would be an iron wall. And each time the Palestinians would rebel, we would have a violent response, a disproportionately violent response to the Palestinians. And they would come to understand their aspirations as impossible and be divided between radicals and moderates. And this would mean that only by doing this, it would be possible to complete the colonial Zionist project, because they, who were the actual owners of the territory, could be the only ones to give legitimacy to the project. The first expression of the idea that to exist Palestinians had to rebel was in 1936. That was a year with a lot of revolutionary aspects around the world. Leaders of the national movement come together in a soap factory in Nablus, and they carry out a protest action which was not very diplomatic, which was a general strike against Britain. And this lasts 6 months, and it spreads to all of the cities. This had become, even before the strike ends, it becomes a guerrilla struggle. the political consciousness of the Palestinians, which is fundamentally rebellious, at least since 1948, is a continuation of that rebellion, and all Palestinians are sons and daughters of that revolt of 1936. In 1948, we have the Nakba, in which 3/4 of Palestinians are transformed into refugees to create Israel, where half of the towns of Palestine were destroyed or where the population was displaced. So many people around the world never knew that there was a people called Palestine or Palestinians. There is all of these people that during the Nakba had been very young, were 20, 30, and they go throughout the planet having this consciousness that we have to rebel to exist. The slogan of Palestinians to say that to resist is to exist was created through praxis. I want to speak about the current situation. There's a contradiction between that heritage of a very important period of time in history in the last 40 years, which is the first Intifada. Intifada in Arabic means the revolt or uprising. And it was the first time in Palestine since 1948 there is a massive mobilization against Israeli occupation. So it was a very important moment. During that first Intifada, there's a very important moment in the exercise of rebellion. If the exercise of rebellion is to oppose the structure of power, the first Intifada was the foundation of a social and political identity, which was separate from the Israeli occupation. In Palestine, a civil society was created with trade unions, with association, with women's cultural, professional organizations that came together to horizontally organize a national struggle and this happened without a state. When have you seen a civil society that is able to do it without a state? And especially in the Arab world, where the countries were created by dividing the territories arbitrarily, and tribal leaders were placed, and the national identity is created in a very arbitrary way. This isn't the way it happens in Palestine. For me, when the first Intifada ended, I was 3 years old. So I had this consciousness, I grew up with the consciousness of the first Intifada. What is happening right now, this question of how this is related to how we find a political solution, there's a relationship between two currents. We have the first Intifada, which has the heritage of 1936, and then the political current, or the attempt to have a political solution, which begins in the 90s, which is to abandon the right to rebellion, which for Palestinians has always meant the right to exist, to abandon that right to rebellion, therefore to exist, in exchange for a project that would be self-determination and some national rights. For example, but not all of the rights. For example, the right of return of refugees is a human right, but we would have to give that up in exchange for having a certain autonomy. So with this promise, this political solution, we have to give up the right to rebellion, which isn't just the right to armed struggle, it's also giving up the right to oppose yourself to the Israeli domination, which is a part of this established power. And this is the situation until the end of the negotiations. So this obligation to give up the right to rebellion is very explicit in the obligation which was imposed on the Palestinian Authority after the Oslo Accords, which states that the Palestinian Authority has to participate in prohibiting rebellious actions by Palestinians in a collaboration with Israel. So we have these two projects nowadays, which contradict each other. On the one hand, this idea of giving up the right to rebellion has no future, because Israel doesn't accept the fact that Palestinians exist. And the peace accords from Oslo have been buried. But there's a consensus in the international community. And in this case, I'm talking about Europe, United States, and the United Nations. That's that international community. That's the only project that is seen as reasonable. That's the only project that has some support and has some possibility of being realized. And then we have this other project, this generation of Palestinians that is returning with the future being blocked, where there's no future, that grew up in this dystopian reality, that accept that to exist we have to rebel, and we come back to that. So even though there's a logic in this, there's basically no support for this, except for the international citizens or civilian movement, which is the movement of solidarity. So this is the reality that exists right now in Palestine with regards to the right to rebellion.
Thank you, Qassam. You construct a very strong presentation and timeline. We'll come back to it in a moment. But first, we would like to talk again to Kristina, who was explaining what's been happening in Philippines, and we can find a lot of common actors and a lot of common points. So first, I would like to ask Kristina, what's the role of the state, the international community, and also the transnational companies? What's their role in the conflict? I'm sorry, Kasam. We want Christina to ask the question to answer the question first. Thank you.
Okay. In the context of rebellion, and specifically the National Liberation Movement, first I'd like to go normative, what the international community would be doing. And I could even go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which commonly I think most countries have signed. There is a premise there which states, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. So, in general, I would say that all states, the international community, should respect the people's exercise of the right to rebellion, no less than the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is which is already, well, supported by imperialist countries and colonized countries as well. The international community has the obligation really to respect whatever is happening in particular countries. This is embodied in the principle of non-interference. So whatever is happening in one particular country, other countries are, well, not supposed to interfere. But of course, that doesn't mean that they cannot support, they cannot endeavor to assist in some way or another these countries, especially if there are human rights violations happening or occurring in these areas. I guess that's what's important in the case of Palestine, where human rights are being readily violated at any given time. So even if the international community has to stand back from the well and recognize the self-determination of countries, of particular peoples, still you would have the obligation to ensure that human rights are observed and fulfilled. Now, in regard to the domestic arena, off the bat, I will tell you that with the right to rebellion, they have the Philippine government in particular doesn't recognize that. In fact, rebellion is a criminal charge in the Philippines. It is in the Penal Code, which was instituted as early as the Spanish era. Clearly, if you are a threat to the state, you are a criminal. The right to self-determination, which is closely related to the right to rebellion, the right to revolution, is this right to self-determination is only recognized in a bourgeois sense for select segments of society. For example, minorities. For example, maybe people. Minorities, especially if they are in possession of prime land, fertile land, uh, corporations in development aggression would still have to secure their, this is common now, the FPIC. This is free, prior, and informed consent, as in the international trends now, FPIC. As I've mentioned earlier, that we have the Moro secessionist groups, but of course the government would only allow autonomy, not absolute separation. And definitely they would not consider, this government would not consider, they in fact reject the philosophy of communism, which is the other, the national liberation movement. Because, well, of course, following American tradition, the Americans are definitely anti-communist. And therefore, our government, in the spirit of opposing the right to rebellion, rebellion is a criminal charge, they have also sought to declare the rebels, the traditional rebels that they have painted, to also be criminals or terrorists, which is why we have this phenomenon called red tagging, um, based off the Red Scare. This was I think, originated in America, in the United States of America. McCarthyism. These terms in the 1950s, they said that communism is a specter that is overwhelming or going to overthrow democracy. And currently, we are trying to fend off this entire phenomenon of red tagging, calling you communists, scaring everybody, and linking you to be terrorists, which is on a different plane. What everybody, or entirely in this community, what everybody agreed to be criminal. Terrorism is criminal. And this is one way how they will isolate the rebels by calling rebels terrorists. To some extent, also, actions by the mass movement have been stifled. If you would consider the right to petition the government to redress grievances, to peaceably assemble, as related also to the right to rebellion, we have laws on public assembly, on regulating public assembly, regulating movement, and so forth. So from what I see it, the Philippines is hostile to the concept of rebellion or even the right to it, even if there is international history, international standards which say that we should really recognize this right. In fact, this is in the 1960s, if I may refer to a General Assembly Declaration, 1514, from the word alone, and we would qualify as part of this declaration. It's a declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. It recognizes that the United Nations, that all nations who have signed up to the Charter, must recognize the passionate yearning for freedom in all dependent peoples and the decisive role of such peoples in the attainment of their independence. Onwards, we have several other declarations. 2105, implementation of this declaration. 2311, the implementation of the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, with specifically roles for specialized agencies and the international institution associated with the United Nations. Why have we forgotten these declarations, which date back to the 1960s? It's because continuously we have had to struggle against a general framework, a general philosophy that colonization no longer exists. The Philippines is one such example that it still does. A semi-colonial, semi-feudal country that continuously fends off the influence of not only the Americans, but all other imperialist powers as well, including China, so to speak.
Sorry, my mic was off. Precisely, Kristina. The New World Order is emerging. How, how does this new world order affect the perspective? It is said to be multipolarism, where China, Russia, Iran, and India are emerging as new centers of power. Does this, in perspective, have an effect or not on the revolutionary struggles? What do you think about this? What is your opinion?
Well, I would have to consider them or figure out, consider if they have developed to be imperialist powers as well. Considering the right rebellion is in the context of subjugation, alien subjugation, or some other countries' subjugation in general. Alien, perhaps you might be thinking about outer space, no? But this would be other countries or foreign dominators. So, in the sense of this subjugation, are these new countries that we have mentioned, India, China, already imperialist powers? In a sense, in our struggle, we have always focused on a narrowest target. There always this one particular group, person, target that should be targeted at any given time. Because if you do a campaign, a comprehensive campaign, and consider everybody else to be your enemy, it will be problematic, especially in your understanding of society. Um, for the Philippine Revolution, for the NDFP, we have been closely following uh, improvements, developments in society. One, China, of course. Let's not talk about the US, clearly imperialist. China, we consider China as a country with and its government with shades of or leading up to imperialism. At this point, it is not yet, in our analysis, it is not yet fully developed as an imperialist country. In fact, the Philippines, to some extent, enjoys well, the Philippine movement enjoys support from the Communist Party of China. However, we think that the Communist Party of China is revisionist. Same goes for the Russian um, Communist Party. Definitely, Russia is now a modern revisionist in terms of communism, and therefore cannot be trusted. In the overall context, we still go back to the US. In the Philippines, it remains as the most important influence. I know it is not the same in other countries, and there would be different analysis in different contexts. But in our country, when we focus on the narrowest target, the United States of America, the imperialist power, we have seen in our experience how they have sought to really mobilize their armed forces just so that they can take footing in the country. It's really very curious because the Philippines is actually in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, South China Sea. So it is a prime jumping ground, so to speak, no, for planes, for materiel, for any other military equipment. It is in the middle of um, to the north, China, Japan, to the south, all other Southeast Asian countries, and a little bit far off to the east would be the west coast of America. It's America already. So we are really the jumping staging point for the United States of America and its military forces. In the global context, we really feel that the Americans are sidling up to us, no, getting on our good side. And it is very, very real at present with a revitalized agreement on military assistance. There is an EDCA, Enhanced Development Cooperation Agreement, which took place of previous agreements on visiting forces, on military bases. And so we see that the Philippine-US relations will continue in place for a very long time still.
Thank you very much, Kristina. So I have the same question for Qassam. Does this new order, you were talking about two possible pathways, and you were talking about the role of the international community, who's the one that dominates and fulfills those two possible roles. So this new order, regarding the international community, does it represent a new opportunity for you, or what insights do you have about the topic?
Can you hear me now? Perfect. I was saying that the Palestinian cause was born with a new world order. Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire during 400 years, and during the First World War, a new world order was born, which was contemporary European colonialism. At this time, they decide the future of Palestine during the 20th century, and this is how the Palestinian cause is born. So, Palestine's right to exist has always been connected to imperialism from a specific pole. But there's something interesting with Palestine. The case of colonialism in Palestine is somewhat unorthodox. It's a form of settler colonialism that doesn't have a metropolis. It's not like the French colonialisms that went to Algeria and then returned to France. This is the Jewish community, which was brought together from all of Europe, and it was a process which was aided by the tragedies they lived through in Europe. And many of them now don't have any connection with those countries of origin, especially the young generation. So what happens is the Zionist movement, created at the end of the 19th century, begins to lead this process. And the Zionist movement couldn't do anything. They didn't have support from anyone. They didn't have support from the European Jews. They could have remained a small group of intellectuals if it weren't for the fact that the British Empire looked at this and said, this is useful. And so why do they say this? Why do they think it's interesting? It has to do with reasons that are connected to what Kristina said about the Philippines. Like with the Philippines, Palestine is a very strategic location. It's in the center, separating Arabs from Asia and from Africa. It's in the center of the ancient world. It's in the center of routes which at that time were the trade routes with India, and that now are the trade routes for oil. It was very important. And the first person to realize this was Napoleon. He was the first to say, to control Egypt, we have to control Syria. To control Syria, we have to control Palestine. And to control Palestine, we need to have a permanent military base, not just a barracks. So the obvious options are the Jews, of course, Jerusalem, the biblical story. It was the obvious answer, and that's the way that they get rid of the Jewish question in Europe. But they hadn't prepared for this very well. So from the beginning, the metropolis of the Palestinian colonialism was a mobile movement that wasn't necessarily in one pole. That's why I spoke about this. In 1947, the First World War had just ended. Great Britain was no longer that great. It was coming out of the war. It was devastated. It had just lost India, And the new world power that was emerging was the US. And the Zionist movement very easily, very quickly, without complications, with no moral or political obstacles, moves its headquarters from London to New York in 1947. And after a long series of meetings with members of Congress, the relationship is created with this new head of the empire. And nowadays, we have China, Russia, and India, which are emerging. In a certain sense, Turkey, Iran are also emerging. So, what could occur? On the first level, on this multipolar level, we're speaking about Russia and China mainly. China was one of the first to support the Palestinian cause in the 60s, but that was China before revisionism, like Kristina said. Nowadays, China and India are some of the countries that have opened up their relationships with Israel, especially through trade. Especially in the case of India, also military exchange and military trade, trading arms and military production. And we also have a crisis of representation, not of leadership, because the leadership of the Palestinian peoples has always been grassroots, but the political representation is in crisis. There isn't a representative political voice that can state that the cause of the Palestinian people should be supported. The political representation of Palestine is focusing on other things. It's in a different type of discourse. It continues to be in the diplomatic route, which they consider to be more pragmatic. So many Palestinians consider that if today the colonization of Palestine is still a colonial project, because you have to understand that there is no settler colonial project without a context of imperialism. No one goes to colonize a land just like that in that way. There's always an imperial expansion behind this. And if in the past the empire was Britain, nowadays it's multinational, international, globalized, and capitalist. Today the center can be in Washington or New York. Tomorrow it can be in Peking. And like the Zionist movement moved its headquarters from London to New York, tomorrow it can move its center from Palestine, outside of Palestine, or out of the Israeli state to Peking or Moscow. And that isn't strange to us. In the end, it's an international context which is motivated by interests, not by ethical or moral matters.
That's very interesting, Kazam. I have another question, and then we'll go back to Christina. So, the cultural issue. As you're saying, culture is also a very diluted form of domination. There are two senses in that, two ways to understand it: the cultural as domination, but also the media and culture as a form of rebellion. How have culture and communication played out?
Yeah, that's very interesting, very important. The greatest expression of the Palestinian cause has been the denial of the existence of the Palestinian people since 1948. So the first act of rebellion was to state that we exist, that we are a people, and vice versa. Exercising rebellion was also an expression of our existence. So, on the level of communication, there has always been a big obstacle for Palestinians during the past decades. Like I said, there was an entire generation that grew up without knowing that there was a Palestinian people, that there was an entire country called Palestine. In the past 15 years, there has been a qualitative transformation that has begun, that still hasn't been finished. It still hasn't reached its full potential. There is still a hegemony of the colonial narrative where Palestine isn't present, but there is a very important transformation, and that's very significant. And this is because of the internet, because there's a young generation that is much more connected globally, including on the cultural level. much more so than generations from 30, 40, 50 years ago. And the fact that the Palestinian reality is impossible to hide. Like someone said, reality is always revolutionary. It's impossible to hide the reality, for example, of the tragedy of the bombing of Gaza, where it's regular people that take their phones and record the bodies of the children that have been dismembered by the Israeli bombs and upload this online. And it's impossible to censor it. And it's shared with people all around the world and makes people ask questions. Who are Palestinians? What is happening with Palestinians? On the cultural level, not necessarily on the communication or mass media levels, Palestinians. Listen, I spoke about 1938. If there was one achievement of that revolt, it's that the Palestinian peasant culture became the official symbol of Palestine. Everything that is seen as the symbol of Palestine, the kufiya, the embroidered dress of Palestine, the traditional dance of Palestine, all of that was peasant culture that for centuries was hidden. The only place where it was seen and was successful was 2,000 years ago in the Bible, in the parables of Christ. Since then, it has always been hidden until 1936. So, since then, the fact that Arafat himself uses the Palestinian peasant scarf as part of his symbolic representation is a sign of the importance that this cultural expression had in the political struggle and the struggle over the narrative. The struggle over the narrative has always been an essential part of the struggle to exist of the Palestinian people, and it's still essential. There are adaptations or appropriations by commercial projects, which happens with working class culture around the world, but it continues to be a very important element of the political vanguard and in the practice of the rebellion. For a Palestinian to say that they are Palestinian, to vindicate their culture, is an act of rebellion. It's a political act, no matter where they are, no matter their level of political consciousness.
That's really interesting, Qassam. Thank you. So, Christina, in the same sense, culture and communication, even education, how has it played out as a way of domination, but also as a way of emancipation?
Oh, sorry about that. So of course, colonization can also be done through culture, cultural aggression, cultural war. And this kind of soft power has been very real, especially in a colonial country or a semi-colonial country, to be precise, as the Philippines. We have had a lot of influence from the West. In fact, they call us the most Western country in Asia. Most Filipinos can speak English. Most Filipinos know about American culture and so forth. We are a very vulnerable people. I have seen personally how we can assimilate cultures of other countries. Came the what's this, the K-pop wave, the whatever new wave from the other countries, from the especially southern west influenced countries. Well, of course, we know that South Korea also has links or ties to American or Western culture. Now, with the onslaught of this soft power, um, all the more do our people, do our young people more particularly, um, distance themselves from the revolution. And this is where the danger or the injury of this kind of development, so to speak, comes in. When they become so alienated from their own culture, from their own history, from their own heritage, that they just wallow into the new things that they are confronted with. Which is why part of a revolution, there should be a cultural component. Cultural, which would include technological advancement, which would include media participation, media roles, and all other factors that would go into how people think or what people think about. And in setting the the national discourse, whatever we were to discuss, the national agenda, we have seen, especially in the Philippines, where social media use is so high that on the average, a Filipino holds two social media accounts on Facebook. There are more social media accounts than there are Filipinos who can use it. I think we are the top users of this account, Facebook. I don't know about Instagram, but probably in the top 10. The Philippines, as I said, is an archipelago, which is why we need this kind of technology. And for us, the revolutionaries, we also really need to take advantage of this technology. In the earlier phases of technology, say, for example, the use of, well, media, all right, the use of radio, AM radio. So our army, the New People's Army, use that to their advantage in broadcasting information, in broadcasting education to a larger arena outside of their areas of responsibilities. Because again, we are an archipelago. We are seeing that we really need to step up with the changes in technology, specifically social media. These are new technologies that we need to take advantage of. At the same time, of course, we are aware that this kind of technologies have also affected or have also influenced warfare. For example, drones, which for the regular person, you would think could be used or should be used only for photographs. Militarized drones have also been used to target, in particular, precise areas for bombing and so forth. So, with this onslaught of technology, we really have to study how we can use some of those elements to our advantage and how to mitigate the impact of others that are not to our advantage. Um, Technology, of course, is difficult to understand. It's difficult to keep track of. In fact, there are so many things that are happening, being developed at this particular moment, and we do not know. And given all these other things that we have to think about, for a regular revolutionary, they usually think, do I have to keep up or do I just keep on with whatever old ways that I am used to? And the challenge has been posed to us by the founder of the Communist Party, John Masison, who, well, he died in December 2022, but his words live on. We have to carry on. We have to learn from experience because otherwise we will be left and lose the struggle. For Joma season, it is also important to learn from the experiences of other national liberation movements, which is why we use this technology to reach out to them, as we do now. Because learning from these other national liberation movements, from experiences, from whatever has been sort of experimented upon them by their own oppressors, there is a lot to learn. And so this development in culture, development in technology, we just really have to keep up because it is part of the struggle. It is part of the war.
Thank you, Christina. Part of the struggle and part of the war. That's excellent. This opens many questions, uh, but we don't have enough time right now. So maybe we could plan a one-on-one section to talk about the struggle in each of the territories. This is just a proposal, so we're not left with all the questions open. Maybe we could talk about the concrete case with Christina and then with Qassam. It's just a proposal because there are many interesting questions. including that topic on the struggle to recover the political subject, which is really interesting and important. I would like to thank you, but first, I would like to ask you to leave a message to the revolutionary struggles of the people from around the world, because there is a new wave of neocolonization or deepening of the existing colonization. We feel it in Latin America, and it's a strong blow against First Nations because they're capturing natural resources. So I'd like you to make a shout out, or to do a shout out to this revolutionary struggle and a call to international solidarity. I would like to start with Qassam.
So, a final call, I'll refer to a very important Palestinian who was practically an apostle of the Palestinian people, especially on the level of the narrative. Ghassan Kanafani, a writer and martyr, that said that the peoples of the world face a common enemy, which is imperialism. And it's like an eagle. It has its wings in Asia, its tail in Latin America, its head in North America, and its heart in the Middle East. And we all have the duty to work together to bring it down. And no matter where we do this, it affects the rest. It's very important for us in Palestine to know that other peoples in the world share this struggle. It's important for us to have this contact, to know that people know about us and that we know about others. So know that you can count on our support, even though I don't speak on behalf of anyone other than myself, but I can feel it. I'm a Palestinian and I'm in Palestine. So count on the support of all Palestinians. And we count on the fact that you will speak with Palestine, that you will communicate with us, and that you won't stop speaking about Palestine. Because this struggle is one and the same. It's not only about solidarity of some, rather, it's about a different world that we're striving for.
Excellent. A struggle for dignity and for people's existence. Christina, what's your message?
Well, just to add to, I agree with what Kasama said, and just to add some additional points. I think I mentioned this earlier, and this was the emphasis of our history. The law of history is that oppression and exploitation will always engender resistance. And you can see that the social condition of people in every period, in every country or in every place at any given time, it will be determined by what kind of economy and political power is holding sway. What is the outcome of the balance of forces? And this is where we come in. We would be the force that will tilt this balance one way or the other. It's true that it is a crime to be neutral in times of oppression, in times of serious human rights violations. You cannot just stand on the sidelines and let these cruel and evil things happen. You have to take a stand. So the challenge really is for us who have already taken a stand is to convince others. And it is in this context that the very existence of war in these seemingly peaceful times. Well, of course, it's no longer as accurate because you have the war in Ukraine. But that is a traditional sort or sense of war that we are looking at. For the Philippines, we have considered ourselves to be continuously at war since the Spanish colonial era. And for the regular Filipino, they don't really recognize or realize that because they only see peace as the absence of violence, the absence of um, shooting forces, of forces killing each other. And in the cities, that's true. That might not be real. But in the countrysides and in other particular areas where the armed revolution in the Philippines is happening, that is all too real. So the challenge for us now is to make all other people see. And those in the above crowd or in the open democratic movement, it has become one of the most compelling tasks, especially in light of what we've already discussed, changes in culture, in technology, developments in culture, and so forth. We just have to keep up. And being subjective forces, we really have to consider that all these things that are happening will happen even without us. And so the question to individual revolutionaries or to individual persons who identify with the struggle, do you want to see these revolutions succeed in your lifetime? And if you break it down that way, you will just consider yourself as one cog in the entire wheel. You will not consider yourself as a messiah or that one person who will change things. And therefore, with this continuous train of people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for this revolution, for the result, then you will last long. And this is a lesson that we have had from over 50 years of struggle, in particular by the Communist Party of the Philippines, by the New People's Army, and most recently, the NDFP turned 50. It is the longest insurgency in the world. I believe the longest running communist insurgency in the world. And we intend to keep on going until we achieve victory.
Thank you. That's indeed the challenge. We have many challenges and a complex situation with many interconnected sides to it. So we have a huge challenge, which is to continue deepening in these revolutionary and struggle processes, in the coordination of peoples in defense of life and dignity. Thank you very much, Kristina and Qassam. It's been an honor having you here. We'll be meeting again. We'll be meeting again to explore the different sides of the struggle and dignity of peoples. Thank you very much. Also, I want to thank the interpreter. It's not a minor work. I want to thank Blandine and also to our comrade who's doing the technical part. Without them, we could not do this. We need to learn and articulate our strength. Thank you and see you soon. Thank you very much.
Yes, looking forward to more. Gracias.
Gracias a ustedes y un honor conocerlos.